Welcome to the webinar online event co-organized by the Mission of Canada to the EU and the Institute for European Environmental Policy, IEEP. My name is Marianne Kettunen and I am the Head of Global Challenges and SDGs at IEEP. And on your screens, with the headphones on, you can see my colleague Megan Tibelius from the Mission of Canada to the EU, who will be also co-hosting us today. And she'll be basically, while I'll be facilitating, Megan will be the one behind the screen, dealing with the questions and things like that, if you have any. So that's the team for you today. And obviously then we're here today to talk about the future of biodiversity. And the reason why we want to be talking about the future of biodiversity is twofold. Firstly, we obviously have entered a new decade. So we are looking at a new biodiversity policy framework, both in the European context, in the EU, but also in the global context as well. So that is obviously something new for all of us to be settling in with when we move into the future, hopefully delivering more for biodiversity conservation than we have done before. In addition to that, as we all know, we are in a pandemic era, which has very much changed everything that we do, the economics, the socioeconomics, and of course that also will have impacts on biodiversity conservation. So we therefore here today to ask ourselves the questions, how can we keep the urgency in the pandemic era for conservation of biodiversity? Because that really is very, very urgent issue to be addressed on a global context. How can we build back better in the pandemic era? Building back better on biodiversity, with biodiversity, conserving biodiversity. And obviously as well, since we have a cooperation in this space now between the Canadian mission and the EU and European participants, we're asking ourselves the questions, how could countries cooperate in this context when moving now to the new era for biodiversity? So that's the scope for today. But before I start chatting more with our participants, few things to the audience which will be helpful to know. So as you see, we're running a webinar mode today, which means that you can't ask questions live, but you can chat through the QA function. So we would really encourage you to send your questions throughout the event through the QA box, and we will be monitoring the QA and picking up your questions along the way. You can also chat among yourselves in the chat box as well. So if you want to be saying hi to the other participants or sharing some information there with everybody, you feel free to do so. But for the questions to the panelists, please use the QA box only. You are more than welcome to tweet about it as well. This event is being recorded and some elements of it might be made publicly available as when we publish some key messages online. So please be aware of that. So please tweet as well, and Megan is going to put in the chat box the hashtag that you can be using while tweeting, while listening in as well. So please feel free to do that. But without any further ado, I'm going to start the event by handing over to Chris Cooter, who is the head of mission of Canada to the EU, to say some welcoming words from the co-organizers side. Please, Chris, over to you.
Okay, how was that? Okay, good. Thank you very much. Good afternoon or morning, depending on where you're joining us from, everyone. First, let me extend my warm welcome from the Mission of Canada to all of you who are joining us for this important discussion today on how we keep up the momentum on biodiversity conservation in the context of COVID-19. Now, as you know, the last few months have been a real wake-up call that has shown us or emphasized again that to take care of ourselves, our societies and our economies, we've got to take care of nature. We already knew before the crisis that healthy ecosystems and genetic diversity can help protect us from pandemics by limiting how rapidly new pathogens can arise and spread. But despite this awareness, we are in the midst of an unprecedented biodiversity crisis, with more than 1 million species facing extinction globally. If anything, the current COVID crisis has actually highlighted the urgency of global action to protect and enhance our ecosystem. But the rapid decline of biodiversity is, while threatening the foundations of our economy and our society, it's not too late to change course. To become more resilient, we need dedicated nature stewardship and integrative approaches to human and environmental health. And the best way to achieve that, we think, is to work together, in particular through the United Nations. The UN Convention on Biological Diversity, 196 parties, so virtually the entire world is party to it, can play a key role in stemming biodiversity loss. A critical element to those efforts, as Marion has already referred to, will be the new post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and its targets. Perhaps it's unsurprising that Canada, with the second largest landmass of any country in the world and the world's longest coastline, is quite ambitious. We've taken some key steps toward the development of this framework. For example, we're advocating for a global commitment to conserve 30% of terrestrial and marine areas. And to that end, last week, we just joined the Global Ocean Alliance, which is focused on protecting 30% of the world's oceans by 2030. Second, we're also taking some action at home with a commitment to protect 25% of Canada's land and marine areas by 2025 and working towards 30% by 2030. And you can imagine with a country as large as Canada, what that represents in terms of area. As we look towards the post-COVID crisis recovery, we also know we can't go back to business as usual. We've got to find ways to work more harmoniously with nature, so we got to build back better. As our Prime Minister has said many times, you can't have a plan for the economy if you don't have a plan for the environment. Nature-based solutions and maintaining natural infrastructure are some of the ways that we can protect biodiversity and wildlife habitat, as well as promote climate resilience. As part of our own recovery efforts, we've invested in making sure that our economic investments coming out of COVID are also green investments. For example, we have launched a program that requires large companies to publish annual climate-related disclosure reports if they want to receive liquidity support from the federal government. We've also committed to developing a comprehensive blue economy strategy to help our ocean sectors, which have been significantly impacted by COVID, and while at the same time advancing our conservation objectives. We're working with international partners to support resilient coasts and coastal communities and to take a leadership role in the global movement towards a sustainable blue economy. For example, by co-hosting with Kenya in 2018, the Blue Economy Summit. We'll continue to seek opportunities to protect and enhance our environmental stewardship, including by actively engaging with stakeholders to ensure that the stimulus funding that we bring to getting out of the COVID crisis supports a more sustainable, resilient, and green future. We know we share that strong ambition with the EU and our friends who've released recently their own 2030 biodiversity strategy. We've got strong allies in civil society as well to make sure that the momentum on biodiversity is being kept up. So today, we're really lucky to bring together speakers from both sides of the Atlantic and to be able to hear a variety of perspectives on how we can all work together to maintain this global momentum. So I want to thank you all in advance. Thanks for making the time today to engage in this important topic. And I'll turn it back over to Miriam to introduce the panelists more fully, and I'm looking forward to a rich discussion. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot, Chris. I could have not said it better myself, so that was perfect introduction to the day. And also, it was kind of nice to set the scene with Canada and set the bar quite high in terms of ambition and what we can do. And let's see later on in the conversation, how the EU is matching that and where together EU and Canada can hopefully help to take the world as well and show some leadership. But with that, I would love to turn now next to our, I would maybe say, honorary guest from this CBD world. So Basil van Havre, who is the co-chair of the open-ended working group on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Now that's a bit of a long title, but basically what it means is that Basil is the person who is steering the ship at the CBD level together with the other co-chair to try to bring us the post-2020 biodiversity framework. And we'd basically love to hear from Basil how things are going, particularly now that we have the pandemic at our hands. So we have prepared a few questions for him in that regard. So Basil, obviously what we know at the moment is that because of the pandemic, we are experiencing delays in the process at the CBD level, the global level, to set the framework. So the process, the preparatory process has been delayed a bit, and obviously also the important conference of parties where things were supposed to be closed and sealed for the future has been delayed as well. So that's what we know at the moment. But we'd be interested to know from you that apart from that obvious delay, has there been impacts of the crisis on the mood and the momentum of the biodiversity negotiations, either better or worse? Have people countries been thinking that biodiversity in the light of the new events will need to be better catered for, or on the other hand, has the impact made people forget biodiversity? So kind of where we are in terms of the mood and the momentum. That would be our first question to you.
Oh, definitely a significant impact on all of us that are working on that, and there are positive and negative aspects to it. One of the challenge we had together with Stefan and others is we were rushing very fast toward the COP, and it was very challenging to get all of the preparatory meeting, the document, the preparation. So one of the positive aspects is now we have more time. Yeah. And we can prepare better documents, better scientific and technical review that will facilitate discussion. And really what it will make is for a better framework, one that will be easier to implement at the national level. Now, on the change introduced by this crisis, we're seeing several things. One I want to start with is the increased interest in the public to invest in protecting themselves from risk. We're facing a huge sanitary risk with the pandemic. People see how the institution can help them protect, and they're ready to make some investment to protect themselves. We've seen the cartoon in newspapers about the 4 waves with the COVID and then the second wave recession, the third one climate, and a big huge one on biodiversity. 1/3 of our economy is dependent on biodiversity. 1/3, that's huge. And then people are ready to take action. The other aspect is, I think there is a very big wake-up call about the role of public institutions in shaping our everyday life, and the fact that people want those public institutions at the national and the international multilateral level to be effective. The third point is change. We've been talking about the magnitude of the change we're looking for, and everybody was kind of looking at us as a bit of lunatics. I think the last few months have proved that society can make a massive change overnight, and some of those change will stick around. I think a number of us are quite enjoying working from home and not facing traffics and cars and things like that. So definitely we're seeing that. Now, we're also seeing unprecedented amount of resource being spent by government to restart the economy. And that is a huge opportunity for us if we can get those decisions to go in the right direction. So by the same token, if you flip that on the round, if those decisions are made in a way that is not favoring nature, we have a challenge, because when we get with our plan sometime next year in 2021, the coffer may be empty, and we're going to have a major challenge there. So some in the cycle of the UN were talking about the super year for nature in 2020. I think if we go in the streets in Brussels or in Ottawa and you ask people, what is the super year for? They probably talk super year for health or something like that. So we're going to have to find a rationale around that. I think we're seeing people are not losing hope. I think there is very clear linkage between what we can do for nature and health, but definitely we're entering into an uncharted territory where it's very difficult to make a plan and a schedule. But I'm confident people are engaged, and we're going to make it.
Yeah, thanks, Basil. I take it from that you sort of summarize that we have a glass half full of potential, but certainly happy to keep on eye very much on the ball that we are not going to lose the momentum, or we can be using the possible opportunities that come with the new era that we are facing, for example, the recovery packages that we can actually take up for that. And I'm going to move on to that space next, asking you a question. But before I do that, just a reminder to all the audience that please, listen to Basil and listen to speakers, and do send questions in the QA box. We are monitoring that, and we want to be also picking up some of the thoughts that you have and passing them on to our speakers as well. So feel free, don't be shy to pose some questions as well. But back to Basil. So you mentioned the recovery money and packages that countries are putting forward. And obviously one of the key topics of today is to then discuss, well, how can we use that money best for nature to build back better on biodiversity? So in your view, I think I have two questions on that space. So first of all, what can we do with the post-biodiversity framework? So the policy framework that will be coming out that can help. So what can the framework help? How can the framework help to use the recovery funds? So what do we need to have in the framework to be able to do that? And secondly, with the recovery packages, there's been quite a lot of talk about the nature-based solutions, which is what biodiversity and nature can offer. So how can we build on nature-based solutions, and what kind of role you foresee that nature-based solutions should play or could play or perhaps already are playing in these recovery packages as well? So two questions. What can the post-2020 biodiversity framework do to make sure recovery packages are green for biodiversity, and what can nature-based solutions do in that space?
And I'm not going to give you the politically correct answer.
That's what we love. We want to have a good discussion going on.
So what I think we are, the global biodiversity framework and the negotiation takes time. And I think what we can do through that massive super tanker that cannot turn very fast is give the direction and the help for the long term. So we can address the notion, we can be part of the solution for protecting people from disease. Particularly, we address two of the major factors. One is on the how we use land and the land use and what kind of stress we put our ecosystem. That is a major influence on how species jump from one species to the other. And the other one is human-nature contact. But the stimulus package and the decision, those decisions are being taken now. I understand for the European Union, there is a financial summit taking place in the next few days, and that's where the discussion. So we have to turn to the specialists in each of the governments, people like Stefan that are able to provide the advice and influence those decisions based on the knowledge and the situational awareness. They don't need the global biodiversity framework for that. But definitively, there is concrete action that can be taken. Chris has talked about some of the action taken in Canada around restoration and the investment. I think we got to keep in mind the notion that the transition and the action we're taking has to engage people. We need the support of people. We cannot afford a gilet jaune type of situation. So I'm really impressed by those decisions where you can take the people that are currently working in oil and gas, for example, and put them to work in restoration. That has been done in the past. In the 1930s in the US president created the Nature Conservation Corps, put 300,000 people to work. And if you visit national park in the US today, you will see that work. So, and then the other one is disclosure and how we can encourage private sectors, cities, and other entities disclose their exposure to risk, and that's going to be very important.
Thank you, Basil. I think I'm going to move on to the next question, which is about your views on the new EU biodiversity strategy, because obviously, of course, we in the kind of the EU space hosting this virtually, however, but in the EU territory. And I would love to ask our global guest in that context, what do you think of the EU biodiversity strategy? And obviously then building on that and looking towards, the COP15 in Kunming in China, what perhaps could Canada and EU, so now perhaps also you reflecting what Chris said and also you maybe wearing your Canadian hat as well, what could Canada and EU do together to work on maybe one thing that would really advance the process? So if you could identify one thing, a core thing that would help to bring a good conclusion for Biodiversity 2020, post-2020 framework, what could that be?
So first, I'll keep my co-chair appetite hat on and talk about. I wish every party to the convention would come out with their biodiversity strategy. That would make my life a lot easier, because then what I like about the European biodiversity strategy is the clarity and the positioning. So I think Francis and I know where the European Union will be hanging their hat on a number of subjects, and that's going to be that is a very significant signal. What is equally important is the way the European Commission and the European Union came to us. I think it's very impressed by the collective work engaging the other directorates in the drafting. So this is not just the DG Environment Strategy. I understand this is also the DG Mare, the DG Agriculture and Climate. So I think that we cannot stress more the importance of the cross-government, whole-of-government approach to creating a plan. So definitely that is huge. I think also what was also striking me is the idea of creating at the same time this farm to fork or strategy. So just kind of cutting it from another perspective and then providing that very important structure perspective. Which lead me to the second part of your question, which is around what is one thing that Canada and the European Union could work together. And I think the biggest thing that Canada and the European Union could work together is to promote a new world for the agri-food. So the farming, the fishery, the processing and distribution all the way to the consumer. So that farm to fork or fisherman to the plate system. I think if we can have a common approach and actually given the integration of our economic system, when I talk to the agri-food business, I could not help but notice that there is both a multinational Canadian European company sitting at the same table calling for that. So I think it's only natural that the governments join force and promote that. So Chris will, I'm sure in his closing remark, comments on the feasibility of this, but that's my call. Thank you.
Yeah, exactly. We'll leave it to Chris, to comment the feasibility, whereas you can do the dreaming. I think, that might be the good thing, but that was good food for thought. I have a few questions for you from the audience. So kind of picking up a number which seem to be maybe relevant here. So we have one question which is about the post-2020 biodiversity framework globally. The question is, how final is the framework as it's being presented now? So apparently the framework was presented, I think yesterday, in the context of the high-level political forum and CBD. So looking at basically yesterday's framework, how presented, how final can we consider it to be, and how much changes there might still be between now and Kunming?
How much change will there be between? So basically, the one thing to understand is that the process for negotiation in biodiversity is different from other ones. People are quite familiar with the process under climate change. We have a bit of a different process in biodiversity where everything is open. You can see everything. So what we presented yesterday at the high-level policy forum of the UN is the latest draft. So the latest iteration that was issued a few weeks ago. We are going to have two major steps before we get to the final COP. We have a step where we get scientific and technical advice, and we will be doing a major update of the framework at that time. Then we're going to get into the final formal negotiation meeting. And then after that, we're gonna have another major rewrite. So I think the structure of the framework is relatively stable. There is a number of places where we put X's and Y's, where numbers will need to be put there, and we will get scientific and technical advice. So that's going to change. And then after that, we're going to have negotiations. So expect some more change there. So. But I would say I've noticed that over the last few months, the overall structure and the building blocks are relatively stable. Thank you.
So yeah, we have a structure to build on which is stable, and then we'll see how the rooms within that structure of the building will change. Great, thank you for that. Then I have another question which is linked to the post-COVID era, or rather maybe the COVID lessons learned. So the question is about whether there's been benefits of the reduction of human activity to biodiversity. I think, we can say that, there's been news about, these benefits around. But then the question is, what kind of steer can these lessons learned during the COVID era and the improvements on perhaps biodiversity be given us in the post-COVID era policymaking? So what kind of lessons can be learned from what we're learning now in terms of how biodiversity can recover, and how can we take those into the future?
That's a very interesting question, and all of us working on the negotiation, I think we're trying to look around the experience of others. And I've been talking to colleagues and retired colleagues that worked on a number of negotiations. I think one thing that we collectively are realizing is the importance of information, clear information about the status of things. A bit earlier today, Stefan and I were with other colleagues from other nations discussing how we can build a better system that tell us, are we making a difference or not? If we look at the previous decades, there was 20 targets, people knew about one, and that's the one on protected area, that's 17 and 10%. So how about we replicate that success on, my wild guess, 20 targets, but I'll settle for half of those, and be able to communicate clearly that whether we're making progress or not. So I think that's one of the lessons learned from the COVID situation, and the necessity to work with others and engage other organizations. The success of the next decade is not going to be the success of the Minister of the Environment or DG Environment. It's going to be the success of the whole of government, the whole of Commission working together. Thank
you for that, Basil. And I think that's a very good segue also to move on to the Commission and move on to Stefan Leiner. But obviously, Basil, just put your hand up, if you want to comment along the discussions as well. I'll bring you in so that it's. But thank you for the being quizzed by me and the audience up until now. But next speaker or commentator and reflector. So we'll get a bit of an EU perspective now to the mix. So we have Stefan Leiner, who is the head of unit from the biodiversity unit of the DG Environment. I think we could maybe safely say that one of the key people steering the ship that then brought us the EU biodiversity strategy. So Stefan, obviously the biodiversity strategy from the Commission sets a quite clear message that biodiversity is and remains an urgent issue, pandemic or no pandemic. And that's, we certainly welcome that from the biodiversity community. But now in this pandemic era, what concrete role do you see, or does the EU see biodiversity conservation playing in the post-COVID-19 recovery? And maybe if you can make it even more concrete, can you lift one or two concrete actions on the biodiversity strategy as it is that can support the recovery from the pandemic? So how can the biodiversity strategy concretely support now the recovery from the pandemic? So with that opening question, over to you.
Okay.
Now you're unmuted. Perfect.
Hello to everybody, and a big thanks first to the Mission of Canada and to IEEP for organizing this webinar, which could not be more topically relevant and timely. And thanks also obviously for inviting me and giving me the honor and pleasure to be part of this important discussion. So basically, I think that biodiversity and if anyone doubted it, I think those of us who unfortunately had to be confined to their homes, they have realized how healthy nature is important for our mental and for our health, for our mental well-being and for our health. There are some people in some member states of the EU who were not allowed to get out of their houses, and they really realized how it is important to be able to go into healthy nature. On top of that, there were many, many reports, scientific reports, articles and others. There were quite a lot of webinars who used that opportunity to also describe very clearly that there is a direct link between the destruction of ecosystems and the emergence of zoonotic diseases such as COVID. On COVID itself, the proof is not there, but there are many, many other examples of previous pandemics where there is a clear direct link about the fact that we are encroaching more and more on the wild nature. We are destroying it, and humans get more and more interactions with wild species, also wet markets and the way that we consume food. So there is clearly a direct link there. And obviously it is our duty, if we want to make sure that we are not fueling these new emergence of new diseases, to stop that and reverse that destruction of healthy nature. There has also been more and more evidence collected that there is also a direct link between the way that we are able to resist and to react to the emergence of such diseases and keeping healthy nature, because it is, and it is with healthy ecosystems that we will be able to have a sustainable economic and social growth on the planet. I always like this way of making a hierarchy, if you want, among the sustainable development goals that the Stockholm Resilience Institute has, which we call the wedding cake, which clearly demonstrates that all the sustainable development goals that are related to the biosphere, they are underpinning any possible form of economic and social development. So they are underpinning all the other sustainable development goals. Now, I will be honest with you, when we were developing the EU biodiversity strategy that has been already mentioned by Chris and Basil and you, we were hesitating because some people were saying, is it really now the moment to come up with something like biodiversity when people are dying, when we have such an economic disaster, when people are losing their jobs, etc. And there was at some point a hesitation, but then thanks to all these reports, it was very clear that now or never, because it is now that we have to demonstrate that we are ready to take the necessary measures in order to really make sure that we have healthy ecosystems, both in the EU, but also contribute to what we can achieve globally on that. The other point is that more than ever, I think, having a successful outcome of the CBD negotiations of the Global Biodiversity Framework is absolutely essential. And that's why we said we have to demonstrate that we are ready to lead by example, to take our own measures seriously in order to be able to contribute to a successful international negotiation. And this is why and I encourage all of you to read the EU biodiversity strategy. In its very first introductory paragraphs, it just makes very clearly the link, acknowledging that healthy nature is essential for a healthy recovery. Also, when you look at the wider EU policy aspects, the biodiversity strategy is fully embedded in what we call the European Green Deal. And that deals with also climate change, with pollution, with a number of wider environmental issues. And this European Green Deal, of which the biodiversity strategy is an essential integral part, the Green Deal itself is an essential integral part of our economic recovery package that was proposed by the European Commission. And the heads of state will discuss in the next few days, actually. There will be a very important summit coming up end of this week, which will decide on this way how we can really make sure we have a recovery. And as Basil has said, we will have unprecedented amount of investments that will happen. And now we have the choice. We can do business as usual, which will lead to a further destruction of biodiversity and ecosystems as we had in the past, or we can really turn the ship around and start to do the right thing when it comes to our future sustainable development. And that's the other reason why it was important to come up with the biodiversity strategy now, because it was the way to make sure that the wider recovery will also fully embed the importance of biodiversity and ecosystems in the recovery. And this has been reflected in the Commission's recovery package, which recognizes the fundamental role that nature plays in our society and economy.
Thanks, Stefan. To paraphrase it, what you just said or summarized, reflect, my very end of my question, which was that, you know, can you pick one thing from the biodiversity strategy that really will contribute to the recovery? I kind of take it from you that you kind of can't pick one thing because it is the whole strategy. It's the whole shebang that, you know, will basically deliver healthy ecosystems, were it in terms of protected areas or were it also in terms of areas which are outside protection, but also need to be in certain good quality to be able to maintain a healthy ecosystem that underpin human health. So I think that's kind of, you know, what you are saying here as well, that, you know, not one thing, but, you know, the whole thing will be able to deliver. Absolutely, and apologies, I didn't get this last part of your question because I was a bit trying to unmute myself. So don't worry about it. Yeah, I would have replied to the question. I think the whole elements, we need more protected areas. We need a big restoration plan for Europe and internationally. We need to get the enabling environmental right. We need to get the resources mobilized. We need to get the science clear. We need to make sure that our governance, as Basil said, we need to be able to demonstrate, are we really collectively making the process that we need? And we need to get the business on board and provide them with the tools that they themselves can take, for example, the decision, I want my business, I want my insurance company, I want as a bank that all my investments are net biodiversity positive. We need to do all that, and obviously we need to make sure that in our trade, in our development cooperation, in our diplomacy policy, that we contribute towards helping that all of the countries in the world have the tools in place that they are able to also take themselves the measures needed to get a good global biodiversity framework, first of all, adopted, and then also even more important, implemented. There are, however, I think a few elements that I would pick out. For example, when it comes to addressing global deforestation, the EU is working towards presenting in 2021 a new legally binding and other tools instrument in order to make sure that the products that are being put on the market in the EU are not themselves leading to deforestation and are promoting, actually, I would say, forestry friendly products. I would say that is very important in the context of what I said in the beginning. There is a link between deforestation, the destruction of natural forests, and these emergence of diseases. And maybe I also mentioned these wet markets and wildlife trafficking. I think the increased efforts that we want to do by also revising our illegal wildlife trade action plan, because we really need to crack down on illegal wildlife trade, which is also very much related to the topic we are discussing today. So these are just two examples, but as you said, the whole package of the strategy is very much relevant in that context. Indeed, but thanks still, you know, highlighting the EU's role in trade, because obviously EU is one of the biggest, or the biggest trader in the world, one of the biggest export markets for the countries around the world, and that basically means that EU indeed can, by setting certain standards, EU can lead the way. But what we also, of course, want to remember, you also highlighted that, you know, there need to be support for the other countries globally. So in that trade context as well, similarly, when EU sets the standards, it will need to think about the other countries and how they can meet the standards as well. So, you know, the cooperation and support in that cooperation side becomes important as well. But that as a side note, I think I'm going to reflect back now, or you know, to the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. And our road to Kunming next year. So Basil felt that, you know, the glass was kind of half full with potential. And I wonder, you know, how do you feel, and how does the EU feel in terms of, you know, between now and the Kunming, when we will be hopefully having a final biodiversity framework. So what would be the key success factors towards the Kunming in your view, EU's view, and what could the EU do? And also, what could EU and Canada do? So basically asking the same question from your side now, what could EU and Canada, together with other like-minded countries, do together to ensure the success? Yeah, well, actually I share Basil's assessment, but I'm a natural optimist, and even there, I must say that we probably never had a context where there was such an awareness of the importance of biodiversity and nature, not just for some nice, cute little animals, but really for our future survival. And therefore, I also have seen never such a mobilization from all sectors. I mean, not just
the environmental NGOs, but also the general public, the financial sector. We have seen recent reports that have made so clear the link between biodiversity and economy. The World Economic Forum has released beginning of the year its first report where they demonstrated that over half of our GDP is directly dependent on healthy nature. They just released today another report where they clearly demonstrate that the way we eat, the way we heat ourselves, the energy we consume, and the different main sectors that are related to agriculture, to food production, to energy, to construction and development, etc. There are pathways that we really can take now and that lead us towards having, I think they said, more than 350 million jobs to be created by 2030, an enormous economic benefit. So all of these sectors, if they are also helping us going into this direction, is again unprecedented. And I will just repeat what happened in the European Union. I mean, never has biodiversity, the Green Deal, other elements of that been so high of the political agenda, it been so central of the overall policy of the EU. And I see more and more in countries around the world the same happening. So everything is basically there in order to make sure we will have a successful outcome. But having said that, there are obviously still some very difficulties, and it will be an enormous challenge to get 196 parties agreeing together, as there are a lot of sensitivities, there are a lot of issues where views are still diverging apart. So what I think what we can do well, I think we already, as Basil has said, by ourselves demonstrating that we are ready to take our own role seriously. And by the way, so far we only have a communication by the Commission, so we still need to have the member states and the Council. The Parliament will also react. So this is not yet the final EU position on what we are ready to take. So we count on really that the member states will endorse as much as possible what the Commission has proposed. But leading by example, showing yourself that that is important, and joining these coalitions. We really welcome the fact that Canada has joined the coalition on protecting 30% of the oceans. We are considering now also joining the High Ambition Coalition led by France and Costa Rica that aims at establishing 30% of protected areas on land and at sea. So we really have very similar common objectives. I think the way that Canada has shown leadership by, for example, organizing the Nature for Champions Summit, the way that we have also in the negotiation seen that we share very much close and similar views on what a successful post-global biodiversity framework be, are things that we need to continue to do concretely, leading by examples, but also engaging in more and more coalitions around the globe in order to make sure that we get really this movement supported to gather in Kunming with a very successful outcome.
Thank you, Stefan. I hear hope. I hear hopefulness also, that the European member states will be supporting European plans, and also therefore the Europe will be supporting an ambitious outcome from Kunming. I think that's a nice way to round up the questions for you and move on to our third panelist, who is Ester Asin, who's director from WWF European Policy Office. And Ester is here to provide a little bit of view from the civil societies side. So Ester, over to you. You've been hearing from our previous speakers and where the global biodiversity framework post-2020 is, and also where the EU biodiversity framework post-2020 is in the post-COVID era. So I'd love to hear from you. How do you see the biodiversity feature in the recovery of the pandemic? Do you feel that the EU biodiversity strategy and also the proposed recovery package contains the right elements to have the successful outcome of this? So what do you think, what has the thinking been at the WWF's side?
Thanks, Marianne, and thanks a lot to the Canadian Mission and IEEP as well for organizing the webinar today. I think it's worth stressing again what Chris Cooter, but also Stefan said at the beginning, that I think this pandemic has really brought our relationship with the natural world into a sharp focus. And we've all realized, maybe we've been forced to realize, that protecting and restoring biodiversity and well-functioning ecosystems are fundamental to boost our resilience and to prevent the emergence of future pandemics, because we know that they will come, and they are very linked, as Stefan said, to the destruction of natural habitats and the natural world. So, and of course, as Commission representative, he knows that, but the fact that the Commission adopted the biodiversity strategy, it was not further delayed, despite many pressures as well. In the peak of the pandemic, for me, it really sends a strong message that a healthy planet is a precondition for a healthy human society. More and more, we are linked. The future of both humanity and nature are linked. And of course, we congratulated the Commission at the time the biodiversity was published, because again, it does have a level of ambition that we could not have imagined, I think, few years ago. And some of the commitments that we've been advocating for since the beginning, but also highlighting, are first the one of the legally binding EU and nature restoration targets. That for us, I think is going to be a game changer, because it's going to have an effect not just on nature biodiversity, but also on climate as well. So we are really tackling the two sides of the problem. The second element is of course, the target to protect 30% of the EU land and 30% of the EU seas, but also to strictly protect in the EU 1/3 of those. I think that's also really important, in particularly the remaining primary and the old growth forest in Europe. And another element, and I think I'm happy to add more, especially the link now with land use and agriculture. And it has been mentioned as well, the link with the farm to fork. The two were published at the same time. So the targets to bring nature back on agricultural land, so targets on pesticide reduction or targets on landscape elements, that for us as well, for WWF and many other NGOs, has the potential also to be a game changer. There are things that don't change much, and I'm sure Stefan is also very familiar with this message, is that of course we need implementation. We keep saying that the EU has the strongest environmental laws, and unfortunately the member states are lagging behind when it comes to implementation. So of course implementation also now with new legislation possibly coming to life, and the political will and the leadership as well at national level. And this is the part of the recovery, the sufficient investment. And this is the part that we, WWF, and we've said that publicly, we've been a bit disappointed. That's a reality, because we thought that the political discourse was ambitious, the strategy, the biodiversity strategy was ambitious as well. And since the beginning of the crisis, we've been saying that a green recovery cannot support activities that are harmful to the environment, and that should include as well substantive investments into a net zero economy, including on nature restoration. And we've been advocating for a quite high target. We've been calling for 50% of the total EU budget to be allocated to climate and environment. And hence, when the new proposal, the updated proposal for the multi-annual financial framework, but also for the recovery package was released, we thought that we didn't really see the role of nature properly reflected and with funds properly allocated. Also because the biodiversity strategy states very clearly how much money is needed every year to really unlock the potential and to be spent on nature. And we didn't see the same figures in the recovery package. So of course, I'd be happy to say more about the work that we are doing around the green recovery as well, and how we are especially pushing on the nature restoration, in addition to many things, as also an area to be looked at in the national and the EU recovery plans.
Thank you, Esther. I hear from you that there are certainly positives there, and I think I agree with you as well. that we were really delighted to see the strategy coming out. From my side or our side, I was delighted to see so many numbers, so many percentages, like so many quantifiable targets. You know, that was something I haven't really seen, you know, during my now relatively long career working in the EU context as well. So that was delightful, but absolutely agree with you. There's plenty to do with implementation, and that's kind of where, and I think everybody agrees around this virtual table, implementation is where the key is. And indeed, there seemed to be work to be done to make the recovery package as it is now to really work for us. There are opportunities, but since if they're not on paper, you have to work maybe slightly harder for them and to make them materialize. So I think that's, we have kind of our work as a community cut out for ourselves as well. But talking about game changers, you mentioned the word game changer a few times, and I would maybe just, you know, ask you to reflect then from the EU's perspective and putting EU in the global context. What kind of game changer role could you then maybe see EU playing in a global context? So these good things that EU has been put forward, you know, could some of those be also then the game changers that will help us to get a globally ambitious outcome as well? Any thoughts on that?
Thanks. Well, it's always, and I feel it's always tricky because on one hand, we constructively criticize, but it's always very constructive. And at the same time, we always ask the EU to play this global leadership role. And it can do it by first doing the homework inside the EU. And again, the EU biodiversity strategy partly provides responses to that, to addressing the EU biodiversity crisis. But it also implies of course, the leadership of these global processes. And in WWF, we are a global organization. I have colleagues working, I mean, everywhere in the world. And these days, people are really looking into the EU to provide this global leadership, because what we are seeing in the post-2020 global biodiversity framework is some parties are spearheading parts, but there's no leadership of the process as whole. This high ambition coalition, I think 30 by 30 has been mentioned. I think it's a very useful initiative, but it's insufficient to really address all the drivers of biodiversity loss. So we really need a major diplomatic efforts to make sure that the COP15 is going to be a success. Otherwise, we'll always have the CBD as the poorer parent, you know, of the kind of nature-related conventions compared, for instance, to the UNFCCC and the Climate Convention. So in the global biodiversity framework, what I think something that it would be a game changer is that the global biodiversity framework has to translate these connections between nature, between climate, and between land use as well. And through ambitious targets to address agriculture, food systems as also drivers of biodiversity loss. And of course, that includes redirecting and aligning the financial flows, because many of those flows still go to destructive agriculture or destructive food systems. So with the aim of, as we all want to see reversing biodiversity loss by 2030. And of course, as in the EU context, there's no sufficient ambition on a stronger implementation, on transparency and on accountability measures to ensure that the global biodiversity framework goals and targets will be achieved.
Thank you, Esther. Good food for thought for everybody, how to be more ambitious and what kind of diplomatic role EU and Canada, for example, could play, and also have that, as you called it, major diplomatic effort to make it happen. Stay online, Esther, because I have a question from the audience for you, but I'm going to basically now use this opportunity to start to look at more specifically the question from the audience. And I have one question which is kind of a twofold, and I'm going to ping that to you, Esther, next, but it's also more broadly the whole panel. So the question is, how can the EU and Canada, in this major diplomatic effort maybe, to collaborate with other countries as well, specifically with developing countries, to improve the biodiversity framework and help the developing countries to adopt the framework. So Stefan and Basil, you'll have some time to think about that and then come back. But the other part of this question is about how to engage the citizens and how to encourage citizens to adopt responsible behavior. And I had the feeling maybe that could be something, Esther, for you and for WWF, I'd imagine you've been thinking a little bit about as well, you know, how to engage with the citizens and help them to take positive action. So maybe you have some thoughts on that, and then I'll hand over to Stefan and Basil to reflect maybe on both of these questions.
Thanks, Marian. It's interesting because this is one of the questions that I'm getting more often about behavior change of citizens. And I don't think that my organization, can tell people what to do and how to do it. But then there is, of course, a role that we play in, of course, raising the awareness and engaging people for them to make, those choices. Something that we've been doing, and it's quite interesting, more and more, we are developing campaigns across Europe that deal with political issues, policy issues, but that seek to engage more and more citizens as well in those political choices. And one example that I want to highlight, because we are just now closing it down in the coming months, is the whole campaign that we did around the Water Framework Directive. And maybe some people in the webinar will say, what's this Water Framework Directive? So it's basically the EU law that sets, that all EU water should be in good status by 27. And the Commission undertook a fitness check of that to conclude whether, the legislation was still fit for purpose. Believe it or not, it has become the third largest consultation of the European Commission ever. We had more, not just WWF, but together with the coalition of NGOs we've managed to mobilize 300 and something thousand people calling to protect the EU law on water. But then, of course, that has resulted in follow-up engagement done by our national offices in different member states, working with supporters about what does it mean, in my daily life, a better, the quality of the water in my daily life. So really working with people, as I said, to change their behavior, but not us telling them what to do. And in the pandemic, we've also seen that, maybe because we've been forced to change our behavior. But I think some people did realize that it's much better to have a cleaner air in cities, that not the polluted one, that we can move faster in cities when we use different ways of transport. And I'm talking about cities because this is where I live and I can comment on. That sometimes is much easier to buy food from your local producer than go to the supermarket. So all of these are important, but one of the principles of WWF, and maybe that's the bridge to the speakers, is that, of course, that's very important, but we also need these public policies to support the change. And this is what incentivizes also citizens to make the change. If we see that, very polluting industries are taking a path of much more circularity, if we see that we are not subsidizing fossil fuel industry, if we see that, we are not bailing out airlines just like this without any conditions, that encourages also citizens to say, yes, change is possible. So we need that. We need that public policies in place to make sure that the change happens. Relying only on citizens, I don't think that is going to be enough. I don't think that is fair either.
Yeah. I think that's a fair point, Esther. But thanks for the good thoughts in terms of how civil society organizations like WWF can encourage people or show some leadership in that respect without telling people what to do indeed. But I think with that, Basil and Stefan, over to you. So the question was indeed do forward. You can pick up from this citizen engagement and behavioral change side of things, but also there was the other part, which was how can EU and Canada cooperate with a broader set of countries, particularly perhaps developing countries, to deliver a ambitious post-2020 framework and then indeed implement it and help the countries to implement it as well. So over to you. Which one of you should go first? Basil, maybe you seem to be ready, so I'll hand over to you.
If that's okay with Stefan. I think there is a number of examples of successful transition, large-scale transition that worked at the local level in the European Union. A couple examples that I've been looking at is the coal transition in the Asturias in Spain and in the Ruhr Valley in Germany. How communities got together with what could have been a disaster, like, thousands of people losing their jobs, and and then turn that into a success by creating a local scale strategy that involved all those involved engaged into that and impacted by the change, and for a positive future. I think that's the kind of approach we need to stimulate around the world. And I think I was really taken by those examples, and I think we got to learn from them. So that's on the developed countries, and I think to a certain extent to the developing. Now, the other question on how Canada and the European Union can work together to foster a change with developing countries. Definitely, there is the obvious overseas development aid. We have agency in both European Union and Canada. In Canada, I understand that our minister for overseas development has an interest in that and has been taken by that, and the discussion are ongoing. And previous discussion with Stefan also indicate that the same thing is happening. So it's not so much about, obviously we need more money, and I'm not going to say no to new money, but it's a lot about what do we do with our existing aid? Do we spend it into more gray infrastructure, or do we spend it into more green infrastructure? But beyond that, I think what we should be looking into is capacity development and technology transfer. And when I'm talking to colleagues from developing countries, what I'm hearing most is yes, there is a need for resource can be found, but the notion of equipping people with the knowledge and capacity to create a bankable project that will be able to bring forward, then those projects get funded. So that's some opening comments. Stefan.
Thank you, Basil.
Yeah, thank you. On citizens, first of all, I think there is another reason why we were able to come up with such an ambitious strategy, is that we had also unprecedented mobilization of civil society on those topics. Esther mentioned the third biggest public consultation. The biggest we ever had was on the nature legislation. So, and that really resonated with high-level politicians. There are some regions, I mean, Bavaria and Germany, where there was a public initiative to save the bees. It was on pollinators, which was the most successful ever. I happened to be in Munich during that time. People were queuing in the cold for hours in order to be able to sign that petition to save the bees. And in a place in Bavaria, they really made that law that is very similar on many aspects that we now have in our strategies, which is about reducing the use of pesticides. I mean, reducing it by 50% in 10 years' time is very ambitious. Having 10% landscape features, having 25% organic agriculture, all of that I don't think would have been possible if our politicians would not have realized that people really care for pollinators, people care for healthy nature, and that had a big impact. And I think we need to build on that. We need to mobilize people in monitoring all these hackathons, all these initiatives to look into what biodiversity they have in their garden, providing them with apps to contribute to the monitoring are more and more actually successful, and we need to build on that. Encourage them to realize that the way that they eat, the way that they travel, the way that they heat their houses, all of that has an enormous impact on nature, and they actually can do a lot. All of that is increasing, and we need to build more on that, combining issues of biodiversity with circular economy, with farm to fork, with food, etc. I think all of that there is a huge potential, and all of that is actually in the Green Deal. Now, I do believe that we really need to, on the second question, to go over this North-South divide that says, you want us to make more commitments, we want you to pay more for it. And it's difficult because I think it's kind of inherent in international negotiations. It always has been like that. But there is an opportunity because people realize that the problem we are having, the loss of biodiversity, is truly a global problem. It affects as much, if not even more, developing countries than it affects ourselves and in the North. And therefore, finding good solutions in order to make sure, yes, that we mobilize more resources, but we also mainstream much better biodiversity into economic policies, into agricultural policies, developing some model that really lead to more income in those developing countries. And there have been very interesting projects, for example, Biofin, that help them also to convince finance ministers in the developing countries that investing in healthy nature is key for their development. And I think a very negative side effect for the pandemic was the total breakdown of nature tourism, which in many countries of the world, they realized how essential that nature tourism that is based on healthy nature was for their own economic development. So we really are all in this together. I think we need to work with them, and in all these coalitions that we mentioned, you have as much developing countries in them that you have also developed countries. You have many countries from Africa. Colombia is playing really an essential and big role. We mentioned Costa Rica and others. So there are many, many others who are there. And obviously, I think that China, being the host of the COP in Kunming, will play, and being in a way at this margin between a very important economic force, but also officially, I think, a developing country. China will play an essential role in making sure we get everybody on board. And we, as Basil said, only this morning we had a meeting with China, because they will play a key role, in my view.
Great. Thank you, Stefan. Also, thank you, Basil. Now, Stefan, you mentioned we all in it together. Now I'm going to be asking questions from the audience. I kind of paraphrasing a little, but the gist of it is that obviously we've been talking about these things all in it together, all at the level of world, the EU, countries. But then the question is, how can we ensure that this all trickles down, so the biodiversity framework globally, in national level, EU, trickles down to the local level, provides opportunities in a local level, also in the post-COVID pandemic context. So what can we say to that end? How can we make it sure, how can we facilitate that local and municipal level will have opportunities available for them to really act on and implement the biodiversity strategies in different countries, globally, EU, in the future? So any thoughts on that? What do the frameworks, the EU framework or the global framework as it stands now, offer to that end? Or is it slightly too far removed and we really rely on the national governments to then do their bits as well? Any thoughts from any of the speakers at the moment?
I think we're doomed. Yeah, I think we're doomed if we just rely on national government. We're trying to create a framework for all, and we've talked about a whole of government, but there is another dimension. It's also a framework for all level of government. At the first negotiation meeting in Nairobi, there was a very clear recognition of the role of subnational government, and that's state or province or lender, but also cities. And since then, there is a group of subnational government called IEEP that is working under the leadership of the Scottish government, creating the Edinburgh Declaration, which is just about that. And I think there is a very important role, and I encourage as many cities and subnational governments to support that Edinburgh Declaration that will be posted soon in the next weeks or months. So my vision, and that's a very ambitious vision, is that when we get to the COP in Kunming, when we get to the final moment where the president will be gaveling the final decision to adopt a framework, I would love to see on the stage not only the normal cast of character, but also representative from civil society, from subnational government, from business. So at the end of the day, this has to be a deal for all, and this has to be a deal for individual citizens that will make a change, but also for all the other level, all the way up to the multilateral.
Thanks, Basil. Then I'm going to ask Stefan's and also Ester's comments on that. And I think, maybe in the EU context, what comes to my mind is obviously, the implementation and funding to support that implementation. And then, any thoughts regard to that, how we make sure that funding and that availability that availability is there for the municipal levels as well. As a one food for thought, but obviously you can pick up any other angles of this question as well. Who wants to go first? Stefan seems ready, so over to you, and then Esther, you follow.
Sorry, no, Basil said it really very well, and this is also our experience in the EU. We can develop the nicest legal frameworks, the best strategies and policies, if the people, the farmers, the mayors, the citizens, the forest owners, whoever, the fishermen, if they don't implement that on the ground, well, nothing will change in our biodiversity. And that's also why there is a very strong emphasis in the biodiversity strategy to develop and to mobilize really those who are actually the ones that make the difference on the ground. Just to give you one example, under the urban chapter, we really we would want every municipality with more than 20,000 inhabitants to develop an urban greening plan, and we use, for example, the urban greening platform under the European Covenant of Mayors in order to work also with the local authorities. The Committee of the Region is also very much involved in that, in order to make sure that also at the local level things are happening. But the member states obviously play a very important role there, and there's always a limit into how at the European level we can directly affect of what's happening at the local level. I would say another very important element is green public procurement, because there again, I think the way that the schools, the way that the municipalities, the way that, I mean, they can decide to purchase products that are leading to deforestation worldwide, or to purchase products that are not doing that, on the contrary. So there is a lot you can do on the local level in the way, and that is absolutely essential. So I fully agree with Basil there, and whatever framework we design has to be for all, not just for governance, but really for everybody at all the levels.
Thanks, Stefan. Esther, thoughts on your side?
Maybe a more mega thought, something that as WWF we've been saying since, well, before, but particularly since the European Green Deal came to life as well. But now we've realized that that's also an opportunity to change the way politics are made, broadly speaking, because some of the things that we are talking about will have a massive impact on people's life. And Stefan was saying, not just on people, on farmers, or Basil said, on people working on coal mining, you know, on many, many people. So making sure that we set a process from the beginning where people feel that, and more than feel, where people are truly part of the decision making and make a contribution. I think that's going to be really important. And I'm happy that Basil mentioned as well the examples of the just transition, because I would agree with that. That's been an area where, and we've worked quite a lot as WWF, where we've managed to bring many different stakeholders together, from the local level to the regions, to the trade unions as well. There's now a just transition platform that has been set up as well. So this multi-stakeholder approach and how it's materialized, it's going to be super important. The same now, for instance, with the initiative about the Climate Pact as well, because that's going to be initiatives to showcase initiatives, but I believe also for citizens to feel that they are part of this decision making. And when it comes to the biodiversity, some of the good examples of the achievements that we've had and we've been having in the past, for instance, when it comes to the conservation of some species, and I'm thinking about the lynx, because that's, you know, the one from my home country in Spain, are the result of these multi-stakeholders, NGOs working together with regional and local authorities, sometimes with owners of, you know, the lands where the lynx are living, in order to make sure, and then with appropriate funding, in order to make sure that, you know, we protect and strengthen the species. So I would very much support that. Then is how we put it in practice. And that, of course, requires also leadership and resources to make sure. Maybe a last one, in France, the Convention Citoyenne, so people really who've been picked up, you know, to sit, to discuss, and to come up with proposals around climate and environment, how these are going then to take it forward, you know, into the French law. So there are many examples now, and I think this is, it's also an exciting time when it comes to rethinking as well our policy making and our democracy.
Thank you, Esther. Really good food for thought from everybody. I have one more final question, which I take from the audience, and this seems to be maybe going for Basil and Stefan, because this is a question about the role of research and development and innovation in the context of the EU and global biodiversity strategies and the frameworks. So how do the frameworks take this into consideration, and what the role is foreseen to be for research and development innovation in the post-2020 biodiversity framework? So Basil and Stefan, and of course Esther, put your hand up as well if you have any thoughts in this regard. But that's the final question from the audience before we start to maybe consider rounding up this event.
So maybe I'll start and I'll respond in a more global way. Definitely, when we build a framework, there is kind of those hard targets with 30% and 50% of this and that, but that is surrounded by means of implementation, which we need to provide. We need to ensure that there is the right environment to make that happen. And then one element of that environment is research and development, making sure that we're enabling the creation of the system and the creation of the knowledge that will lead to those good discussions. So definitely that is very clearly recognized in the framework, and I'm sure Stefan will enlighten us on the detail in the European context.
Yes, thank you. Well, research innovation is absolutely key, and another reason why we are able to have this strategy is because we had the IPBES report. I mean, let's be very honest about it. I think it made a huge difference, like IPCC did in the climate negotiations. The IPBES, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, in its really landmark first global assessment of ecosystems and biodiversity, that made a big difference, because not only people realized that there is a global scientific consensus about the severity of the crisis, but they also clearly identified what are the main reasons for that biodiversity loss. And that helped us also in developing our strategy to address those direct causes of biodiversity loss, which is the unsustainable way that we manage our land, the conversion of the land, overexploitation, pollution, invasive alien species, and climate change itself. So that is one aspect. The other aspect is that in the strategy itself, there is again a very strong emphasis on increasing research, and the New Horizon Europe has a very strong component. There are several missions that we call them that have a strong biodiversity element. A new biodiversity partnership is being developed with a big response from the member states that will generate a lot of funding into basic research, and also for the first time the monitoring will be a central part of it, because that is something that is often neglected. In order to do good policies, in order to monitor where you are, you need the fundamental basic knowledge about your own biodiversity. And we are, for example, thinking of next year having a project that we call the Red List of Taxonomists, because that is an area where we have less and less in Europe. And we have seen it in the pollinators debate that for many of those species, we don't have the people who are able to identify them to really know what is the reason for that pollinators decline. And a lot of the information was just because there were some, luckily there was still some private volunteers that are interested. It should not be like that. It should be really something that any country should make sure that we have that basic research available. And we will put all of that together into a new biodiversity, a new knowledge center for biodiversity. All of that is an essential part of our strategy. We need to really invest more into basic knowledge, into monitoring, and into developing the innovative tools that we will need to get that transformative change that IPBES is calling for.
Thanks, Stefan. Esther, do you wanted to say any thoughts on the innovation side?
Very, very shortly, because I have to confess that's maybe not my area of comfort, but I would tend to agree with Stefan that we also need this, especially the data to inform and be science-based to inform the political decisions. And we've been missing some, as he's been saying, for instance, on decline of pollinators and others. So definitely that could help. We've also, I mean, people are mentioning about the role that artificial intelligence can play, you know, in also in agriculture, in improving some of the, you know, the harvesting as well. I think what is important in research and development is that we also invest or support research that could develop new carbon neutral technologies as well. That's going to be really important, especially for the industry. If we are serious about decarbonizing our industry and our economies, we'll have to invest as well in research and innovation and producing new technical solutions. So that's very general thoughts, because as I said, it's not really my area of work, but it's clearly something where and it's been mentioned, the Commission does have, a lot of capacity in terms of investment with the Horizon 2020 and of course the whole research program, and it has to be wisely, I would say, wisely invested.
Thank you, Esther. I would have one unscripted question for all the panelists, and I hope it's going to be easy enough, so it's not going to be throwing you too much off your guards. But to try to make things also more personal and think, how to take things forward, I think certainly me and the audience would love to hear. So, what would be the next thing that you plan to do this week or next week? What is the next thing on your list that you'll be basically taking forward in the context of supporting post 2020 biodiversity strategy at any level? In doing so, what could others do? What kind of help could you welcome to make that a success, that your next step a success? So just making it more personalized to what's next on your agendas, and what could be done with that. Basil seems to be nodding, so I think he's on it. So I'm going to hand over to him first. Stefan keeps his face, so I think he's either now panicking or wondering he already has an answer to ready. But Basil, over to you first, and then Esther and Stefan can follow.
I should never play poker with Maya, because I would lose all the time. In terms of what is the next big thing for me, we're in the process of rewriting another part of the framework, and the part that is not about the target, which is around all those elements around science and monitoring and reporting, etc. And that's a very significant piece of work for us, for the team that works with me. So that's what's going to be occupying my mind over the next few days and next week. What I need from participants, from the 100 or so people that are on this call, I think one thing we got to remember is the difference in the system between our various countries. Europe in general is very attuned to a system with rules and laws and those kind of things, and other part of the work's more work by consensus and setting goals first. So definitely I think what I'm looking for is to keep in mind that the cultural, social reference frame change from continent to continent, and it's very dangerous to assume that everybody is working on the same reference. So that's my one message. Thank you.
Thank you, Basil. Stefan, are you ready if we go in order of the speakers?
Yes, thank you. Well, there are so many things on the plate. Publishing a strategy was already a lot of work, but then the work actually starts now, and we now need to explain to the member states, explain to the members of the parliament, explain to everybody what is meant by what, and making sure that really we get support for then having it also implemented, and starting to also do the impact assessment for the legally binding targets. Putting all that in motion is a major thing. So I'm actually longing to have a bit of a break, to be very honest. And in that, maybe try to see how I can get more biodiversity into my own garden, because I think, as I said, what we do ourselves as individuals can have a huge impact, and that's where we all should start.
Thank you, Stefan. But hopefully the message taken by, if anybody's online from the government's side, we could use some help. Commission could use some help, in terms of mandating the biodiversity strategy. I think that's obviously some help that could be provided. Esther, how about you? What's next for you, WWF, and what help could you use?
Well, Stefan, I think going on holidays, because it's been very intense for all of us. It's been very interesting working in this virtual setup, in the final stages of finalizing the strategy and what it's meant for us as NGO in the way we dialogue with, especially with the Commission. For me, in WWF, we have a group which is made up of different people working on different regions and key countries. We promoted this idea of a new deal for nature and people. So to make 2020 the super policy year, now it's going to be 21. So we'll be having very soon a call, I think it's now in July, exactly to discuss where we stand in our global, global strategy. So how we are making sure that we move forward towards the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, but we are also influencing the right stakeholders like the EU and other countries. So discussing this internal strategy, that's something that we continue doing very soon. And I think it's also worth mentioning, because it has been mentioned, how we work with developing countries. We've produced for our offices who are based in Africa, in Asia, and Latin America and others, a series of tools and materials to start engaging in the conversation with EU delegations, around the programming of EU aid, to make sure that, EU aid is supporting also this transition in those countries. So these are a couple of things internally, they are keeping us busy. And on my personal thing, we still have a petition. I don't know whether it's still open. That's another thing that I would like to highlight about people's mobilization. We've partnered with different campaigning platforms where we move and Avast, and we've managed also to mobilize not just, but other colleagues working on the environmental side, 1,300,000 people calling for a green and a just recovery. So I would like really to echo the importance of people adding those voices and calling for this change for nature and for people. So that's what we are going to do on Friday, actually. We are going to hand over the signatures to the ministers.
That's something very concrete. With that, I wholeheartedly thank Basil, Stefan, Esther, you from the lovely chat, and also very informative chat, obviously. And I hope that, like myself and us in the call, also the audience has benefited from this information, also hopefully enjoyed us hearing us chatting as well. But for the last final words, obviously, thank you from my side, thank you from IEP's side, and thank you to Mission to Canada, the EU, organizing this. But I'm going to hand over to Chris for the last words, which I'm sure will be equally perfect as his welcoming words as well, even though he did have to blip off from the call momentarily. But Chris, over to you.
Well, first, thanks, Marianne. A great big thanks to you and all the participants. I thought this conversation was really encouraging, which is not where we were in March. We started talking about having this webinar, and then COVID hit. But curiously and unexpectedly, I think this conversation has revealed that COVID is actually adding momentum. There's still great ambition. 30-30 by 30 is part of it, but we're talking, Basil and others mentioned, going beyond conservation to restoration. And I think as well, COVID tells us a little bit how we do this. We have to have leadership, we have to have transparency and targets, but equally important, we have to have citizenship. And I think together we can have collective action that makes a difference. And we've seen that in COVID already. So now we have a template. No more excuses. We have ambition, we have some hope, we have targets, and we need to get on with it and go forward. So last point I would want to make is that between the EU and Canada, we are very like-minded. I think we can lead by example in our own countries, and we can lead by helping other countries to achieve the biodiversity goals that they're aiming for as well. So a great future for our combined work on this project. And I want to thank you guys again for all your help. And thanks to my own team as well.
Great. With these thank yous, I think we can all summarize this, with a really quite familiar face. Yes, we can. I think yes, we can for biodiversity. So that will be a very nice way to end this call. So thanks everybody. Thanks everybody on the call. I hope you have a good week and make some steps to protect biodiversity. That would be great. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.